As part of their enduring commitment to justice, equity, and expression, the Open Society Foundations are proud to sponsor Many Lumens. You're listening to Many Lumens, where we talk about and find meaning in the intersections of art, social change, and popular culture. I'm your host, Maori Karmael Holmes. For this episode, I'm speaking with Astria Suparak, an artist, writer, and curator based in Oakland. Suparak's creative projects have been exhibited and performed at ICA LA, the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts, and as part of the Four Freedoms series. Her curated exhibitions, screenings, and performances have appeared at art institutions and festivals such as the Liverpool Biennial, MoMA PS1, and Expo Chicago, as well as for unconventional spaces including roller skating rinks, sports bars, and rock clubs. Suparak also produced a visual essay on science fiction, futurity, and Asian material culture that appeared in BlackStar's own Scene Journal. In our conversation, we talk about her introduction to Riot Grrrl culture as a teen and the intellectual through line from her punk rock beginnings to her work now. We also discuss the relationship between her identities as both an artist and a curator, and about the many projects she has worked on recently, such as Asian Futures Without Asians and Tropicolage. Now, for my conversation with Astria Suparak. So I want to start off asking you about, where you grew up and what you thought you might become as a grown-up.
I grew up in Los Angeles. I didn't leave California until I was 18 and I went to college. I was always interested in art and making stuff. And then I got a really good scholarship to go to art school. So that made the decision for me.
Do you remember when you first felt, an aha moment related to art?
I do have a really distinct memory in preschool of painting and really digging it. So I must have been, 4, 5.
Mm-hmm. In 2002, you were featured in The Independent, and they ran an image from your childhood journal where you had written that you wanted to someday be an artist and a scientist. And I'm always really fascinated by the clarity that children have. And I was curious, where did this desire come from to be both of those things?
Well, I think the scientist thing I can quickly answer. That was probably because I liked animals, like most kids. But I would actually read field books about different species. And then in terms of art, I was always drawing as a kid, and my parents kind of dug that. So they didn't discourage me. And by the time I was in 5th grade, I was known as the art kid, and I would enter contests like the library bookmark drawing contest or the county fair contests.
Doing a lot of research for you, I read that you made your way to Riot Grrrl culture. And I was wondering, what were you looking for and how did you find yourself in that scene?
So an older friend in high school introduced me to Riot Grrrl. She took me to some music shows and some Riot Grrrl chapter meetings in San Gabriel Valley. And going to one music show is a gateway drug. Then you have access to a bunch of flyers for more shows. Then you can learn about more bands, more music venues. There might be zines that introduced you to different ideas and writers. And this was how we learned stuff pre-internet, for printed materials.
Yeah.
And then one of the most useful things about Riot Grrrl and punk was learning that there were alternatives to what mainstream culture showed as possibilities or options.
Yeah. Is there something about you as a young person in that time that you've retained?
It's still within me, this idea that if you're not seeing yourself represented in your community or in popular culture, or if you're not seeing your interests or your values reflected, one of the things you can do is to create your own version of whatever it is you need to see. Mm-hmm. And that anyone can do this. You can make your own music, publications, festival, whatever creative project, even if you don't have the right education or background or skills.
The skills part is interesting. I think you do need the skills, but I guess you can learn them. You can definitely pick them up.
In terms of punk music. One might say initially you do not need the skills.
Fair, totally fair. Can you talk a little bit about Big Miss Moviola, which later became Joni for Jackie, and how you discovered it?
Big Miss Moviola was an underground film network that Miranda July started in 1995. And it was this chain letter format where any female filmmaker could mail Miranda their video and $5. And in return, you'd get a videotape back with your movie plus 9 others. And then each videotape came with a booklet of letters from the filmmakers to the other people on their chain letter tape. So that's how the project connected people across the country who wouldn't otherwise meet pre-internet. And I first saw Miranda perform at the LA Riot Grrrl convention in 1995, which was organized by a couple of friends of mine. And then 3 years later, when I was in New York, I invited Miranda to present selections from Big Miss Moviola at the film series that I ran at Pratt.
I did want to ask you about your time curating and organizing exhibitions and public programs at Pratt. How did you get into that?
So I only went to Pratt because they offered me the biggest scholarship and because it was in New York. And I didn't do a ton of research beforehand, which I do not recommend people considering college. So as a result of that, I became frustrated with the school because all the different disciplines were siloed off from each other. And I wanted to see and try everything at the time. So in my sophomore year of college, I started a weekly film series as an alternative education for myself. So programming started for selfish reasons. And I wanted to provide a platform for artists in politics that I believed in. So this kind of goes back to your earlier question where initially I wanted to show alternatives to sexist Hollywood movies. Mm-hmm. And I did this through showing work that was experimental, work that wasn't easily accessible to the public, and work by women, queers, and people who were outside of the United States.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. I did a similar thing in undergrad, not a weekly film series, but I found myself organizing concerts and conferences my freshman year when I got to Howard. And so much of it was about what I wasn't getting in the classroom. So I totally understand.
Yeah.
One of our guest producers for this episode is a friend of yours, Ted Passon. And he made a connection between your background in punk circles and its touring culture and your approach to your itinerant curatorial practice. He said you were one of the first film curators to take a screening program on tour. And I was wondering if you agree with this observation, or had there been other models that you looked to?
Yeah, at the time, there were festivals that would tour with a programmer, and there were filmmakers who would tour with their own work. But I don't think there were really independent curators who were touring with other programs that I can recall. Mm-hmm. But yeah, since I was coming out of a music scene, and I was used to seeing how bands toured mm-hmm. and organizing tours in a DIY style. Now that I'm thinking about it, a lot of the people who were touring were white male filmmakers. Mm-hmm. And after I was touring for a bit, I also had been told by several white male filmmakers that they started touring because they saw me touring, then realized that they could do it.
That's fascinating. I while you were in Riot Grrrl, I was in more sort of a backpacker, or I think at the time we called it conscious hip hop. And, I think the learning that I had from doing work in that same way, the kind of community building, I've definitely took into, I think, what we now call sort of impact campaigns or, social engagement. And it really is trying to connect with people and the things that they're, into, basically, not thinking about demographics, but more kind of psychographics. Mm-hmm. And it is something to hone. And I just think it's a really interesting skill to have. But I'm also curious, what influenced you to travel with your programs? What made you say, this was really awesome, I should take it somewhere else?
It didn't occur to me to tour until I was invited to tour.
Okay.
And the very first time I was invited to do something outside of New York was with Andrea Grover at the Aurora Picture Show in Houston, Texas. Mm-hmm. She was like traveling back to New York to visit her family, and she like made a meeting with me, and then was so shocked to find out that I was a college student. And then that reminded me that I had like creatively omitted that I was a student because I was so worried that people wouldn't take me seriously, basically. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this was before Google image search, right. Before you could find out people. So people would just see like your signature on email or mm-hmm. like on listservs. So I wrote director of the program because sure. And it's like a lot of people just assumed I was like a fully adult staff member.
That's amazing. I'm also wondering, I don't know if this is something I'm projecting. So, you know, I think about the things that I created because I wanted to see them and I wanted them to be there for my own work. But along the way, I spent so much time kind of organizing that I stopped making work. And I'm wondering if that is all, you know, do you relate to that at all?
Yeah. So I trained as an artist, was always like identified as an artist identity when I was younger. Mm-hmm. And then curating just became more viable or desirable from other people of me. Mm-hmm. So, I started touring my spring break of senior year. Mm-hmm. And then pretty consistently toured for like 6 years after that as an independent curator, and didn't have time to develop my own art making. Even as a curator, I was always creating work, but for years it was submerged under my curatorial identity and was often like anonymous or collaborative or in service to other artists' work. So it's only been in recent years that I've been able to embrace that artist identity again.
Yeah. Well, what made the space for that? I mean, I wanted to ask you that later, but let's go now. Like what was it, the pandemic, or was this before the pandemic that you were just like, I don't know, do you have a big birthday? And you were like, I've got to get back to making work.
It was not being employed as a full-time curator anymore.
Okay.
Also having some writing opportunities or publishing opportunities that I was able to turn into more creative projects. Mm-hmm. Like that's a huge thing, is having opportunities that are loose where you could be more creative, you know, whereas maybe they expected like a traditional essay and then I pitched something different and they're like, that's cool too.
I want to go back to just to ask one last question about touring. I was wondering what kind of venues and spaces were you on the road to? What was it like for you, especially if you know, as a super young person?
Yeah. So first, like all the programs I was putting together were commissioned by specific spaces. So like I'd make a program specifically for that film festival or that art space. And then I would tour that same program to reach like a more general public and a greater amount of people. Tours would be seeded with, or like based around invites with more moneyed places like universities. And then I'd fill in the dates and the geographical spots with places like there was an abandoned mall in Louisiana. That was amazing. An elementary school in Washington, D.C., a roller skating rink in Philadelphia, which was organized by our dear friend, Ted Passon. There's the sports bar in Dallas. And I did a lot of shows in bars when I was in my 20s.
And what are some lessons broadly that you feel like you learned in, you know, this era?
Finances, budgeting, like being a self-sufficient unit. Like I would tour with, initially it was actually 16 millimeter film prints. And then after 9/11 and the restrictions around luggage and carry-on and all that, then, and with the advances with video technology, I was then touring with like mini DV, with backups on DVD and my own like portable player.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd have like the whole setup. I'd have like 2 or 3 programs, and then I'd have like clothes for 3 different seasons. So being able to like troubleshoot, have things in multiple formats, be flexible and light on your feet.
For sure.
And then maybe also mentioning like funding while touring.
Mm-hmm.
So basically this was like based in me working as an independent curator and learning about funding, figuring out what to ask for, avoiding all the places that expect you to work for free or for like not a reasonable amount of money, and learning to ask for a guarantee, which is like more of maybe a music world, or like, I don't know, it wasn't necessarily like, it was something that I had to learn basically. And when I was touring independently, I was also splitting my income with all the artists.
Mm-hmm.
So like universities, I keep bringing up universities, but they really had like some of the biggest fees at that time. But when I did shows at bars, it would be that split, which is typical at a bar, where the bar gets 50% and you get 50%. And then I would then split that 50% with like 12 other artists. So it's kind of ridiculous in terms of not being steady income. And I didn't have an apartment for like stretches of time while I was touring. But I just wanted to toss in like some really specific financial stuff because sometimes that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And something people don't think about.
Yeah. And it's also like it's not necessary to do that now. Like there is Vimeo. There's a lot more options. Like physically bringing the work from place to place was different then. Like there was no other way to access some of that work.
Yeah.
And that's a whole can of worms, like talking about festivals, right? And
yeah,
working online.
Can you talk about how you approach your role as a curator generally? I mean, I love that you came to this. I hate the word organic because it implies there isn't any rigor, but, you know, without sort of being trained specifically in curating, right? And coming to it out of your own interest. I would love to hear what you think about it, because I really was interested in curating as a young person because of people's clothes, and I really liked being in museums and gallery spaces. And then I felt like I studied art history in undergrad initially, and I had some internships, and I got really turned off to the environment and what I felt like was a kind of posturing, you know, like it wasn't interesting to me. And then of course I found myself back at it because I realized I could do it how I wanted, but, you know, 1,000 years later. And so I was just curious for you, you know, what is it about curating that like was great, is great for you?
Well, I saw curating as an extension of my art practice initially. Like it was a way to explore ideas, to create experiences. I see it as a platform for artists and politics that you want to support. Like it's a way to introduce people to new ways of thinking sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And where do you find inspiration for the shows and series that you've worked on? Were they 100% commissions, or were there any things that you organized on your own?
Oh, I mean, the commissions were loose too.
Okay.
I think once I was like asked to curate something around the theme of water, which was not that interesting to me, but that was probably the narrowest thing. I think a lot of other places were like, we want new work that we haven't shown before at the time. So what has exhibited in that space before, you know, like not wanting to repeat that. If I'm curating for like a gallery that I'm directing or something, like seeing what the overarching connections across the year are. General inspiration like comes a lot from like seeing the work and making connections between work across time.
So in addition to independent curatorial projects, you've also worked for a number of cultural institutions. And I was wondering if you find it challenging to switch from those two modes, you know, sort of like the looseness of independent curatorial projects to the constraints, but also security of a year-round position that sometimes comes with a lot of admin work.
Yeah, I'm really glad that I don't have to deal with all the bullshit at universities right now, although I also am adjunct teaching, so there's that. There was something really nice in being able to explore a gallery space, or to like revision and try to make it feel different through different exhibitions. Like, and I'm kind of blurring my curator and artist experience here, but as an independent person or an exhibiting artist, being able to see what the house expertise is. Like if you get a chance to work with someone who's like an incredible woodmaker, or, you know, that can be great as an artist to be able to learn more about something that you haven't tried or need to like delve more into for your future work, as opposed to like the position you're often in where you're getting to like invest in people and giving them the tools and building up their skills to like continue to grow. And that's like more fulfilling in one way.
At Carnegie Mellon, you made a big name for yourself with a lot of well-regarded shows, including a retrospective of the Yes Men and a retrospective of the Riot Grrrl movement. I was wondering if you have another show, you know, under your belt. Are you thinking of another big show like that for the future? If you can talk about it.
I'm not. I mean, I working as an independent curator for gallery spaces is really hard, because places have curators on staff already. Often they're only working within a network of the other curators who they know about, or like a equivalent venue, you know, in terms of like their prestige or whatever. Mm-hmm. And for me to start to do that as an independent curator is like really hard to shop an exhibition, like without the stability of an institution backing that time that I'm researching. I mean, if you're lucky and you have time to research, that I'm not going to actively work on an exhibition of that scale. Mm-hmm. I have like a ton of ideas though, but that is like quite a commitment.
I noticed, you know, it came up in several interviews about you being asked to step down from a position after you curated an exhibition where you had been requested to remove the word feminist from the description. And I started thinking about, you know, being in my 20s, you know, I worked as a teacher at this like experimental charter school, and I was totally questioning their methods every single day, and they kind of got tired of it. And so they asked me to leave. And, you know, I worked at an art center, and I was like going on and on about some social justice issue, and they also asked me to leave. And, you know, it was never about my work, right? And so I'm very clear about that capacity. But I think about like I think you need this moxie when you're in your 20s to rail against injustice and to, you know, have certain kinds of principles. But I was curious for you, you know, if you look back on the position, you know, after the exhibition with the feminist in the description, would you do things differently now? Or did you feel justified in everything that happened?
I mean, it boils down to I had a bad boss and it was a bad experience. Yeah. But I'm proud of the work that I did. Like the exhibitions and the programs were popular. There was a ton of enthusiasm for them. Mm-hmm. We had like national, international reviews of the shows. So the fact that one person could make a decision despite all that evidence of success points to the flaw in the system. Yeah. I mean, I think also, I don't know if it's the same with you, but because of those experiences, I think about how terrible organizations treat people and how they've like frittered away all this goodwill, this energy, this new or young employees that have like all this excitement. Mm-hmm. And how an experience like that just really like, it's like terrible for morale. All of this could be handled so differently. And it's also like damaging and traumatizing to a lot of people having these like horrible work situations.
Yeah. And it often like shifts the entire course of your life, or at least like a decade, you know, sometimes too, of what you feel like you can, attempt. So I want to move into a bit of a section to ask you about, your practice as a visual artist and wondering how you would define your practice.
I mean, there's just the formats, which is something that I'm just expanding in the last year or two of installations, videos, collages. But yeah, I think there's also kind of a through line about the kind of work that I've been doing as a curator and an artist, which is, I would say it's about identifying what's being overlooked, bringing attention to societal problems or structural inequalities and trying to put that into a relatable frame.
Mm. And I know we talked about it a little bit more, but I would just love to ask here, what has it been like making the jump from organizing other people's projects to putting your own out into the world? What has shifted in your relationship to the public?
It's more of returning to an earlier artist identity. I only became a curator because it became more financially viable than art making. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the shift, I'm not thinking of the audience as much as an artist than I am as a curator.
Mm-hmm. What impact do you think your curatorial experience has had on your art making experience?
Curating has given me useful professional tools that I can use in my art making, in terms of budgeting and contracts and being able to articulate my needs and to problem solve. Recently, a couple curators told me that working with me was way easier than most artists because I provide all my materials organized and well labeled.
Facts.
Label those files. And then I think also I've been providing more context about my work, anticipating that a curator will need to write about the work or look for a quick description. Mm-hmm. So that's been useful.
Scene is a journal of film and visual culture focused on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities globally. Subscribe today and receive 2 beautifully designed issues a year, featuring essays, reviews, interviews, and more from critics, artists, and other luminaries of color. Learn more at scene.blackstarfest.org.
You're listening to Many Lumens. And now, back to my conversation with Astria Suparak. I'd love to talk about your recent project, Asian Futures Without Asians, which, just for folks listening who may not know, this is a project which asks the question, what does it mean that so many white filmmakers envision futures inflected by Asian culture, but devoid of actual Asian people? So I want to ask you, Astria, how did this originate?
So I like sci-fi. Mm-hmm. I watch a lot of it. And I've always been painfully aware of how Asians are not or how they're either absent in or portrayed in mass media. And then I was part of a Trinity Minha reading group at the Wattis Institute in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And we were studying her work. And at the end, we were asked to propose a project for publication. Mm-hmm. And I had proposed this project in which I would be looking at how Asian culture is presented in sci-fi. And I got so into the research and wrote way more, 10 times more than what could fit in the book. And so I broke that off into an hour-long performance lecture and then the smaller visual essay that was included in the book. And then I've spun that out since to gallery installations and other videos and other projects.
Yeah. I mean, what I have witnessed so far has been incredible. And I feel like it is so rich that I imagine it can keep going for quite a while. You're drawing upon cinematic motifs, exploring how food, fashion, design, architecture, landscape, and even in some ways, surrogate sort of Asian bodies or these anglicized names of Asian-ish names have this Asian presence, but not actual bodies in this kind of Hollywood imaginary. And it made me think about Greg Tate's anthology, Everything But the Burden, which, as it relates to Black people, is like, they want everything but the burden, and I imagine it's a similar idea for Hollywood or the world, in air quotes, wanting this Asian experience without the, experience of being, the lived experience of being Asian in the US or Europe, maybe. I did want to ask you, though, what is the next phase of Asian Futures? Are you imagining a larger exhibition, a book? Is there a film?
Well, the performance was intended to be presented in person so I could feel how the audience is reacting and adjust. And I haven't been able to do that during the pandemic. So I do have one venue lined up for an in-person, well, actually throughout the pandemic, various times we've thought we could do it in person and then it's had to move to Zoom. But I would really like to be in the audience to see how they're reacting, because I'm performing it without hearing anybody. And then I'd like to make more involved installations with multiple screens, controlled lighting. I'd like to make another video. I'm basically looking for more resources and time to make new work. So I've been applying for grants and fellowships. I'd really like to do a residency at a museum or a university that has an archive in art, architecture, armor, fashion, to do more research.
Yeah. My brain is spinning. I want to help figure this out, but that's not what we're doing here.
Amazing. I also wanted to specify that Asian in my research is not limited to East Asia, as America typically thinks Asian means, but it's inclusive of West Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and then also the areas that have been considered Asia or paired with or blurred with in terms of historically, if that's North Africa, which is part of Orientalism, or Pacific Islands, which in America is often paired as a category.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. We definitely have very rigorous show notes. So we will be linking to your essay and scene and other spaces for people to explore that. But thank you for sharing that clarity. I do want to talk about your essay and scene, CD Spaceports and Colony Planets, which was in Scene Issue 2. And, beautifully expanded on one of the core tenets of this project. But I wanted to talk to you about the art making in it, in which you use collage in most of the work. And I was wondering how this kind of visual sampling, and to use another sort of trend term, it's kind of a reassemblage, but how it shows up in your process, with the visuals. Are they coming to you first, or are you writing first and then sourcing visuals? Are they kind of happening simultaneously? How are the collages coming in to be?
Well, first, I want to say that I loved working with the scene team and working with Caroline Washington. So for the project in general, maybe I could talk about that, how I'm sourcing all that material first, and then go more specifically into collage. Sure. So first, with the process for Asian Futures Without Asians, just as a series, I'm watching a ton of sci-fi. I'm screen grabbing any of the Asian elements that I recognize or I'm not sure about, and I'll research later. And then I figure out the different ways to organize the materials and see what the reoccurring elements are. And then that's what guides my research. And that leads me to like more histories and cultures to look into. And then I also connect with like outside experts and cultural consultants. I have this group of maybe 36 people that I check in to like quadruple check detail about how to pronounce something, about like something that I'm not getting from my other, ways of researching. So that includes like people who are like fashion historians, martial artists, and architects. And then the writing comes after to shape that into a structure. And then I rearrange or reobtain the right images or clips for the final work. So that was kind of long. But with the collages, like some of those collages for scene and for some of the installations, and in the presentation, like some of those were open-ended designs that I'd have to alter every time I watched a new sci-fi movie or a new sci-fi TV show that had like a conical hat or a red paper lantern. And then with the videos, for that, like I often have this idea of what I want to do. And then that every time so far has changed as I'm like putting together all the materials. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you want me to talk about helmet to helmet a little more? Because I could talk a little more about that. Actually, I would like to.
Great.
So it's called Helmet to Helmet. I don't think I had a title for it when it was published, but there's this like embedded timeline in the piece where it's roughly the older sources are in the top left, and then it like moves down and then over to the bottom right. So the oldest stuff are illustrations from the Philippines from the 1700s. And then there's images of occupying European armies wearing the salakot, which is the Philippine, one of the Philippine conical hats. And then you see how the salakot was adapted to the pith helmet. And you see those in like photos of occupying European armies in other parts of the world, like in Egypt and Jordan in the 20th century. I mean, I could say something about this video tropic collage in case that's useful. So with the video tropic collage, like initially I was thinking of a collaged GIF to live on a website, which was like the commission was for a digital project. Mm-hmm. But then last minute, the organization said that they weren't able to host that on their website. So then I made a looped video, which is like a more similar format. And now that's been exhibited. Like that was originally made for the internet, and now it's been exhibited in galleries. And I've created like a vinyl mural to frame that video. So that's been fun to like change the format and create like new settings for it.
Yeah. One of the films that you talk about, of course, that's bedazzled. This is a quote: "Bedazzled with Asian culture, but drained of actual Asian people," end quote, is Star Wars, which you meticulously and humorously critique. And so, a lot of people know that George Lucas cites Kurosawa as an influence, particularly Hidden Fortress or Seven Samurai. But I'm wondering if you see this relationship, little less homage and more violently, right? Or maybe more ominous. And I'm projecting onto you, but what do you think about this citation? Is it a balanced one?
Yeah, so people know that he was heavily influenced by Japanese culture in particular, but is also like referencing a lot of West Asian culture. And the fact that he, for decades, like could not find a single Asian person to hire or cast is like, I think pretty damning. Mm-hmm. Like you're going to use all these elements, architecture, fashion, philosophy, language, like in some of the names.
And mind you, you're in California. You're
exactly.
Not.
I was just going to say that. Like, it's not like he lived in a place that was entirely like Finnish.
Since you've begun this project, have any Hollywood institutions reached out to you? Well,
the Hollywood Reporter did like a feature article on my work. I'm not sure if that counts as an institution. Since that, as well as a sci-fi podcast called Imaginary Worlds, there's been more actors and producers who've been following me on social media, including the producer of The Walking Dead. And there's been some organizations, but I don't know how formally, that this reaching out from Hollywood would be considered.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, I imagine things are going to shift. I loved, too, that you started off with, I was going to ask you later, but you started off with letting us know that this came from a reading group with Trin Minh Ha. And I don't really have a question here. This is just sharing. But her work and bell hooks, they're the two theorists that really, changed my entire worldview. And I wouldn't even say they changed it as much as they, affirmed it. I had nascent thoughts as a young person, and reading their work gave me a lot of permission to literally alter language, to talk about, bell hooks calls the gaze, and I didn't have the language for that. And so I just really love that, Trin started this for you, just because she also is so foundational to me in many ways. So I just want to say that. I did want to ask you, though, thinking about that statement, who are some of your intellectual North Stars? Who shifted how you think about the world?
The people that I'm looking at a lot right now are people who have moral clarity, people who can process what's happening in the present and connect it to a longer history, who can clearly state their arguments. Mm-hmm. So I've been following a lot of historians and journalists like Nicole Hannah-Jones, Jamel Hill, Kevin Blackistone, who I got to work with recently, which is great. I mean, recently being a few years ago. And then art people like Stephanie Sihuko, Aruna D'Souza, David Hammonds. There's also Jennifer Doyle, Margaret Middleton, and Kathy Park Hong.
Thank you. There's a levity in your work in a lot of the titles. They're very funny. And I was curious if you've explored comedy writing at all. Is there a feature screenplay that you attempted or that you want to attempt,
I'm not known for my humor, so I am glad that you find the humor because I find them funny. I feel like I'm just thinking about how the humor is more obvious in this series. Mm-hmm. And I think that was helped by it being a pandemic. And I was just kind of in my own bubble laughing to myself about these things. Mm-hmm. And the performance of Asian Futures Without Asians really pushed me in a lot of ways to try new things, including performing for an entire hour and trying to be humorous for an audience, which is, as I mentioned, really weird when you're doing it on Zoom and you can't hear if people are laughing.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you see the humor. And no, I've never tried any of those formats you've mentioned.
Okay. Is there anything that you're hoping to attempt professionally or otherwise? You have a lot of life, we hope. And is there, are there other things that you want to pursue?
I mean, being a food critic would be cool. But I'm lactose intolerant, so I can't do that. Actually, maybe that's more just about being able to eat for free is very appealing. Eat well for free. But in terms of art, I'm still figuring out where I fit in the contemporary art world. Mm-hmm. I'm in an exploratory mode. I'm still learning about myself, experimenting with new materials and ideas. And that's what's most exciting for me right now, having time and resources to explore. And then in the experimental film world, I'm not sure if I'm really fitting in there either. I applied to a dozen film festivals, but only the ones that were free or that gave me a waiver. Mm-hmm. And only one festival accepted one of my works. So it feels not a great use of my time. Yeah. So I'm just figuring things out.
Yeah. No, that's totally fair. Is there anything that you want to share that you feel like you were maybe burning to say and didn't get asked?
When I was younger, I was already fighting people's assumptions that I don't belong. in certain spaces or doing certain jobs. So it was hard for me to ask for advice at the risk of appearing incompetent, which also relates to how in the beginning of my career, I didn't collaborate with other people. And I was very clear that I had put together the programs because I didn't want people to feel, because I was trying to prove myself. And then I didn't want to give people a reason to attribute my success to someone else, especially a man, since the majority of other curators were men. And I feel now that I've established myself, I feel totally different in that I love collaborating with other people and not feeling like I have to be the absolute expert in every aspect intellectually and like technically in something in order to make something new.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how, in our society, right, which is like colonial and capitalist and all of these things, that you take on the ways of the colonizer to protect yourself from him.
Yeah.
And then you repeat those behaviors, right? Which is actually not how you want to actually move in the world. And there was another quote that one of the producers had wanted me to bring up, but I didn't because I just thought it was a little too esoteric. But it was thinking about Trin referencing a kind of cultural void in sort of like white or European culture and being that kind of like a spiritual morass in a way, and so you fill that void with things. But I think that's also related to, I have also, I think, held things back for fear of people claiming them as their own or that I wouldn't get credit or things like that. And that's why I was bringing up earlier that people know often who is really doing something, but sometimes they don't. And people do steal from you and people do take credit for your work. And it's such a fine line because you don't want to be this person who doesn't collaborate or who, you know what I mean? I'm assuming what you're saying is how I also feel. It's like, that's actually not my natural position. But then you like develop this armor so that you can kind of like exist in this world in which people do that all the time. And it's a really awful dichotomy to exist in.
Yeah, I completely agree. And those kind of two drives are like maybe egos, like especially with artists, how having your name out there, having your name be associated with the creation is so like core, but then also learning about more generous, collaborative, open ways of working and not always being at the center, I think is also really important. Now that I've had experiences as an artist in a group show, I think curators should get out of the way sometimes and spotlight their artists. Not naming any names, but
that was to me, everybody. All right.
Thank you so much for thinking of me for this.
Yeah.
It's really incredible what you've done with this podcast. And I listened to Sky's interview a few days ago and really enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, have a good week. I look forward to the next time that we interact.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Okay. Thank you so much. Bye. Infatuated by yours. To find out more about Astria's work, check out her website at astriasuparak.com. You can also follow her on Instagram and Twitter at Astria Suparak. This season of Many Lumens is brought to you by Open Society Foundations. It is produced by BlackStar Projects in partnership with Rohome Productions. The host and executive producer of Many Lumens is me, Maori Karmael Holmes. This episode was produced by Dallas Taylor. Associate producers are Irit Reinheimer and Farah Rahaman. Our guest associate producer for this episode is Ted Passon. Managing producer is Alex Lewis. Executive editor is John Myers. Our music supervisor is David Little Dave Adams, BlackStar's Music and Cinema Fellow supported by the Pop Culture Collaborative. Our theme song was composed by Vijay Mohan and remixed by Little Dave. This episode features music by Jasmine Cassell. If you like what you've heard so far this season, please leave us a review on Apple Podcast and let us know what you think of the show. Sending you light, and see you next time.